In the county records of Colleton District, South Carolina, the entry is brief, filed under the year 1858, in a ledger later transferred to the State Archive after a courthouse fire displaced half a century of paper. It notes only that a disturbance of a religious nature occurred on the Vale plantation, on a night in the month of October, and that no charges were filed. Nothing else survives from the county itself. What survives instead comes from other places. A family Bible passed through 4 owners, a bundle of letters found in a tin box beneath a Charleston rooming house floor in the 1960s, and the recollections of a woman named Hannah Reed, recorded late in her life by a folklorist collecting testimony along the Combahee River. Taken together, these fragments describe a night that the official record chose to forget, and a plantation that spent the rest of its existence trying to forget it as well. The Vale plantation sat on a bend of the Combahee River, in the low country east of Walterboro, where the water moved slow and brown between banks of cypress and spartina grass. It was neither the largest nor the smallest of the rice plantations in that stretch of the district, but it was, by the account of a travelling minister who passed through in 1856, well-ordered and quiet, in a way that unsettled more than it reassured. The main house stood on a low rise above the tidal fields, white-columned, its windows facing the river, so that Augustus Vale could watch the barges come and go without leaving his study. Behind it, along a shell path lined with crepe myrtle, stood the outbuildings, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the overseer's cottage, and, some distance further, at the edge of a stand of live oaks, a small wooden chapel that the Vale family had built in 1841, in the year that Augustus married Eleanor Pruitt of Beaufort. The chapel was not large. It held perhaps 40 people on plain benches, with a raised platform at one end and a single window of coloured glass above it, ordered from a glazier in Charleston as a wedding gift from Eleanor's father. For 15 years, it had served as the place where the enslaved people of the Vale plantation were permitted to hold Sunday service, under the supervision of a white minister who came out from town, as the law required. It was, by every account that survives, an unremarkable building. Then, in the spring of 1856, Eleanor Vale died inside it, and after that, no one on the plantation entered it after dark. The circumstances of Eleanor's death were, on paper, simple. The Vale family physician, a man named Dr. Ezra Coffin, signed a certificate stating that Mrs. Vale had succumbed to a bilious fever after several days' illness, and that she died in her own bed on the 14th of April. The church register recorded her burial 3 days later, presided over by the Reverend Gideon Marsh, in the presence of her husband and household. There is nothing unusual in either document, examined alone. It is only when they are set beside a third paper, a receipt discovered much later, showing that Dr. Coffin had travelled to Columbia on business between the 9th and the 18th of April, and could not have attended anyone in Colleton District during that week, that the simple story begins to come apart. But that receipt would not surface for more than a century, and on the night this account concerns, no one within the Vale household appears to have known it existed at all. What they knew, instead, was smaller and stranger. They knew that after Eleanor's death, her husband had the chapel's door fitted with a new lock, one that could be secured from either side, an unusual feature for a building meant for worship. They knew that the pastoral visits continued on Sundays as before, but that Augustus Vale himself never attended them, standing instead at a distance near the oaks, watching the door. And they knew, though few said it aloud, that something had happened in that building on the night Eleanor died, something involving her, the pastor, and the plantation's longtime overseer, a spare and quiet man named Silas Crow, who had managed the fields since before Augustus's marriage. For 2 years, the chapel sat mostly closed, used only for the Sunday services the law obliged the family to permit. Then, on an evening in October of 1858, everything changed. According to Hannah Reid's later account, the trouble began 3 days earlier, when Augustus Vail discovered that a ledger was missing from the locked drawer of his study desk, the plantation's second account book, kept separately from the formal one shown to visiting factors and creditors, and containing, by Hannah's description, numbers that did not match what anybody was told. Augustus questioned the household staff individually at first, calmly, almost politely, according to the cook, a woman named Delphine, who was interviewed decades later by the same folklorist who spoke with Hannah. But by the third day, his questions had narrowed and his composure had thinned. On the evening of the disturbance, he ordered Silas Crowe to gather every adult enslaved person on the property, 34 in total, all of them grown, none younger than 17 years by the plantation's own inventory, and bring them to the chapel after supper. No explanation was given beyond the missing ledger, but almost everyone who later recalled that night agreed on one detail. The choice of location made no sense if the matter were only a stolen account book. The smokehouse would have served as well, or the yard in front of the overseer's cottage. Instead, Augustus chose the one building on the property that no one entered willingly after sundown, and he chose to lock its door from the inside. With himself, Reverend Marsh, Silas Crowe, and 34 people who had spent 2 years avoiding that room, sealed together until morning, if he wished it. The Reverend Gideon Marsh, summoned from town for what he apparently believed would be a short and formal inquiry, arrived just after dark. He later described the scene in a private letter to a colleague in Savannah that survived among his papers as orderly, though heavy with a silence I did not care for. Augustus stood at the raised platform where the pulpit had once held Sunday scripture readings. On it now sat the Vail family Bible, a heavy volume bound in dark leather, its spine cracked from generations of use, brought down from the main house for the occasion. Around its closed cover, and this detail Hannah remembered with particular clarity because it struck her as wrong the moment she saw it, was tied a length of black ribbon, knotted twice, holding the book shut as though it were something that needed restraining rather than something meant to be opened and read. Augustus told the assembled group that someone among them had taken his ledger, and that no one would leave the chapel until it was returned or its taker identified. He instructed each person to come forward, place a hand upon the Bible, and swear before God and witnesses that they had not touched his private papers. It was an unusual demand, legally meaningless and religiously improper by the standards of the church Reverend Marsh served, and the minister said as much quietly to Augustus before the swearing began. Augustus did not answer him. He only repeated the instruction to the room. What followed, by every surviving account, was slow and strange rather than violent. One by one, the 34 adults came forward in the lamplight, placed a hand on the ribboned Bible, and spoke a denial. Hannah Reid, when her turn came, noticed that Augustus would not look at the book itself. He watched the faces of the people swearing upon it, and he watched the door. But his eyes moved away from the Bible each time, as though the object itself troubled him more than the ceremony he had built around it. It was past 9 in the evening, by Reverend Marsh's later estimate, when a gust came through a gap in the chapel's siding, a known weakness in the building, mentioned in a maintenance note from a carpenter's ledger 3 years earlier, never repaired, and knocked the Bible from its stand. It fell open on the platform floor, not to the book of Genesis or the Psalms, as a Bible falling open by chance might be expected to do, but to a place near its center where the pages did not lie flat. Hannah, standing closest, saw the reason before anyone moved to pick it up. A rectangular cavity had been cut into the block of pages, deep enough to hold several folded papers, concealed for years perhaps. beneath the weight of the black ribbon that had kept the book from ever being opened by accident. 3 items had spilled loose onto the floorboards: a letter, its paper gone the color of weak tea with age; a single sheet listing names, in a hand Hannah recognized at once as Eleanor Vale's own; and a legal-looking document bearing a notary's seal and a signature she also recognized, dated some 12 years earlier. Augustus moved to gather the papers with a speed that Reverend Marsh in his letter called unbecoming of a man who claimed nothing was wrong. But he was not quick enough. Hannah, who had spent years learning her letters in secret while serving as Eleanor's personal attendant, a fact Augustus did not know, and one that would matter more than anything else that happened that night, saw her own name written at the top of the list. Beside 11 others she recognized from the room around her before Augustus snatched the page away. From that moment, Reverend Marsh wrote, "The character of the evening changed entirely. It ceased to be a search for a stolen ledger and became something else, something none of us, I think, including Vale, fully controlled. What the documents contained and what they meant would take the rest of that long night, and much of what survives of this story, to unravel." For the 2 years before Eleanor's death, life on the Vale plantation had followed the same rhythm as a dozen others along the Combahee. Rice planted in the flooded fields each spring, cut and threshed each autumn, sold downriver to factors in Charleston, who shipped it further still. Augustus Vale had inherited the property from his father in 1847 and had, by most outward measures, run it competently. He kept accounts, paid his overseer well, and was regarded in Colleton district as a serious, unspectacular man, more concerned with numbers than with company. The rhythm of the days themselves is described in fragments by more than one surviving source. A visiting factor's agent, passing through in the spring of 1855 to inspect the coming rice crop, wrote to his employer in Charleston that the Vale property struck him as well managed, if a touch cold in its ordering, noting that the enslaved workers he observed at the tide gates and the threshing floor moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had long since learned the exact boundaries of what was permitted and what was not, and gave nothing more away than that. Delphine, the cook, in her later interview, remembered the days before Eleanor's death as quieter than what came after, though she was careful to specify that quiet did not mean easy. "Nobody sang loud in that kitchen," she said, "not because nobody wanted to, but because loud carried and carrying was a risk nobody needed." She recalled Eleanor Vale as a woman who came into the kitchen more often than most mistresses of her station, ostensibly to discuss menus, but who lingered afterward, asking questions that had little to do with food. How long certain families had been on the property, whether any letters had ever arrived from relations sold away in years past, whether anyone still remembered the names of people who had once lived in the row of cabins nearest the river, torn down years before Delphine's own arrival. It was in this quiet, unremarkable stretch of years that Hannah Reed came to occupy her particular position in the household. She had been assigned to Eleanor's personal service not long after the wedding, chosen, according to Delphine's recollection, because she was quick with her hands and quicker with her ears, and it was Eleanor herself, in violation of both law and custom, who first taught her letters. Slowly, over the course of long winter evenings, when Augustus was occupied elsewhere with correspondence or with Silas Crow's reports from the fields. Hannah described this instruction, decades later, without sentimentality. She said Eleanor never called it kindness, and neither did she. She needed eyes that weren't hers, Hannah said, in case her own stopped being trusted to see what needed seeing. I didn't think on it as a gift. I thought on it as a job, and I did the job. The tensions beneath this outward calm were, by every account, slow to surface, and slower still to be named. Silas Crow's overseer's log from these years records nothing but weather, planting schedules, and the ordinary business of crop and labor, save for one entry, dated the autumn of 1855, that departs from the pattern. Mrs. V, asking after old records again, told her they are Mr. V's to keep, not mine to give. The entry is followed by 3 weeks, with no further mention of the matter at all, an irregularity uncharacteristic of Crow's otherwise meticulous habits, as though something in that exchange had unsettled even a man, not easily unsettled. His marriage to Eleanor Pruitt had been, by the standards of the district, a good match. Her family's Beaufort connections brought him credit and standing. His land brought her family a foothold further up the Combahee. Whether the marriage was a happy one is harder to say. The surviving letters from Eleanor to her sister in Beaufort, 6 of which were preserved and later donated to a historical society archive after being found among a descendant's effects, describe a woman increasingly troubled by what she witnessed on her husband's property, though she wrote carefully, aware, it seems, that her letters might be read by others before they reached their destination. In one letter, dated the summer of 1854, Eleanor wrote to her sister that she had begun to keep my own accounting of matters here, separate from Asa's, for my own peace of mind, and because I do not believe his book tells the whole truth of what is owed, nor to whom. In another from the following winter she wrote more plainly still, I have asked Hannah to remember certain names for me, in case paper should ever fail, where memory will not. Hannah Reed, in her recorded testimony a century later, confirmed this. She said Eleanor had asked her, on several occasions in the last year of her life, to repeat back a list of names, always the same list, growing slightly longer each time, as though she were teaching me a hymn she was afraid the church might lose. What Eleanor Vale appears to have discovered, and what she appears to have been preparing to correct before her death, was a fraud that had been running beneath the plantation's official records for over a decade. The document found in the Bible, the one bearing the notary's seal, dated 12 years before the night of the chapel, was a deed of manumission, drafted and signed by Eleanor's father-in-law, Augustus's own father. Shortly before his death, freeing 11 people named on an attached schedule, in gratitude, the document stated for decades of service, and in provision that they be granted land, tools, and traveling papers sufficient to establish themselves elsewhere. The deed had never been filed with the county. Augustus, 23 years old and newly in control of the estate at the time of his father's death, had instead kept the freed individuals on the property, listed in the plantation's public ledger as purchased labor, their names altered slightly from the schedule to obscure the connection. Their existence on paper made to look like ordinary property rather than free persons unlawfully held. Eleanor, it seems, had learned of this only gradually, piecing it together from old correspondence, from Hannah's memory of names spoken by older members of the household, and this is where the second document becomes significant, from the plantation's second ledger, the very book Augustus had reported missing 3 days before the night in the chapel. That ledger, according to what later emerged, was not primarily a record of stolen wages or unpaid debts, as Augustus's questioning of the household had implied. It was Augustus's own private record of a second fraud, layered atop the first, payments made, over a period of years, to a clerk in the office of the district's Register of Deeds, to alter or misplace records concerning several of the 11 originally freed individuals, records of sale, transfer, and in 3 cases, the falsified documentation of death, so that persons who were, by their own grandfather's decree, legally free, could be quietly sold onward as property to plantations further south, their names scrubbed from the Vale Estate's inventory as though they had never existed there at all. It was this ledger that a carpenter on the plantation, a man named Jonas Bell, 40 years of age, enslaved on the Vale property since childhood, and skilled enough in his trade that he was regularly sent to do repair work in the main house, had discovered some weeks before the night of the chapel, while replacing a section of flooring beneath Augustus's study. Jonas could read only haltingly by his own later account, relayed second-hand through his daughter to the folklorist, who eventually recorded much of this story. But he could read numbers well enough, and he recognized enough names among the columns. Names of people he had grown up beside. Some long departed from the plantation under circumstances that had never been explained to those left behind, to understand that something was deeply wrong with what he held. He did not return the ledger. He hid it in a gap behind a loose board in the smokehouse, and told no one but his wife, waiting, it seems, to decide what to do with what he had found. It was this disappearance that Augustus discovered 3 days before the chapel gathering, and it was this disappearance, not any theft of household valuables, that drove him to lock 34 people inside the one building on his property, most saturated with the memory of his wife's unexplained death, and to place upon its pulpit the Bible in which, unbeknownst even to him at first, that wife had hidden the very proof of what her husband had done. The confession itself, such as it was, came haltingly, and not as a single continuous account, but in fragments, drawn out over perhaps an hour, according to Hannah's later recollection, as Augustus alternated between demanding that Marsh explain himself to no one but the two of them privately, and Marsh insisting, with a firmness that surprised those watching, that whatever was said now would be said before the room, since the room had already seen enough to deserve the rest. Reverend Marsh began, Hannah recalled, by addressing not Augustus, but the assembled 34 directly, an act of address so unusual from a white minister toward an enslaved congregation that several of those present later cited it, independently, as the moment they understood the night had become something entirely different from what it had begun as. He said, according to Hannah's memory of his words, that he had known of Mrs. Vale's intentions regarding the deed her father-in-law had left, that he had believed those intentions just, and that he had, for a time, agreed to help her see them carried into effect through the proper channels of the county court. What halted him, by his own account, was a visit from Augustus in the early spring of 1856, some weeks before Eleanor's death, in which Augustus informed the minister, calmly and without threat, that he had learned of his wife's plan, and that he wished Marsh to understand the full extent of what its success would mean, not merely the loss of 11 labourers, whose absence Augustus claimed the estate could ill afford, but the exposure of the second fraud already then underway, the falsified sales and altered records that had, by that point, already sent several individuals south under fabricated papers. Marsh told the gathered room that Augustus had not asked him to lie. Precisely, he had asked him only to delay, to counsel patience to Eleanor, to suggest that such matters required careful legal preparation, lest they be challenged and undone by hostile creditors after her death. Buying time, in effect, without ever stating outright what the time was being bought for. It was this delay, Marsh said, that had still been in effect when Eleanor died, her declaration drafted but not yet filed. Her husband and her pastor both aware of what she intended, and neither having acted to stop nor to assist her in bringing it to completion before whatever happened to her in the chapel that April night occurred. Beyond this point, according to every surviving account, Marsh's confession broke down entirely. Pressed by Augustus to say nothing further, and appearing, by Hannah's description, genuinely uncertain himself how much he was willing to say aloud, regardless of what Augustus wanted, the minister retreated into silence, repeating only that he had already said more than he had ever intended to say to anyone, living or dead, and that the rest was a matter between himself and his own conscience, not fit for further airing that night. What this partial confession left unresolved was made clearer, in fragments, By the letter itself, once Hannah was briefly permitted to read it in full before Augustus recovered the pages from the chapel floor. Eleanor had not simply learned of the fraud. In the last months of her life, she had drafted her own document, a declaration intended for the county court, disclosing what she had found, restoring the original deed of manumission to legal force, and providing, from her own inherited property and a planned sale of a portion of the estate's outlying acreage, funds for the emancipated individual's resettlement. She had entrusted the drafting of this declaration in part to Reverend Marsh, whom she believed shared her conscience on the matter, and who had, in fact, initially helped her prepare the language of it. But Marsh, according to his own later account, lost his resolve when Augustus discovered what his wife intended. Rather than proceeding to the county court as Eleanor asked, Marsh brought the matter to Augustus directly, believing, he claimed, that he might persuade husband and wife toward some quieter resolution. What resolution Augustus proposed, and what happened in the chapel on the night Eleanor died there during what the household understood to be a private meeting with her husband, her pastor and her overseer, Reverend Marsh, would not say in full, not that night, and not in the letter he later wrote to his colleague in Savannah, which broke off mid-sentence at the point where he began to describe what occurred after Eleanor confronted her husband in that room. Whether his silence reflected shame, complicity, or simple unwillingness to commit certain facts to paper cannot be determined from what survives. What is certain, from the death certificate's false attribution to a physician who was not in the district that week, is that the official account of Eleanor Vale's death was constructed rather than observed by men who had reason to prefer a fever to whatever had actually taken place. Back in the chapel, on the night of the disturbance, none of this history was yet spoken aloud in full. It surfaced instead the way Hannah Reed later described most things from that night, not told, but let slip, the way water finds its way through a wall nobody built quite right. Augustus, having recovered the fallen papers, attempted to restore order, insisting the matter was a private family affair, unrelated to those gathered, and ordering the group to resume their sworn denials regarding the ledger. But the room had already shifted. Reverend Marsh, according to Hannah, would not meet Augustus's eye, and stood near the door rather than beside the pulpit as before. Silas Crowe, who had said almost nothing all evening, positioned himself between Augustus and the assembled group in a way that seemed, in hindsight, less like enforcement of Augustus's authority than an old man calculating silently which way matters were likely to break. It was at this point, well past midnight by Hannah's recollection, that Augustus made the decision that would ultimately undo whatever chance he had of containing the night's events. Unable to force a confession regarding the ledger, and increasingly aware that the names on Eleanor's list had been seen by more than one person in the room, he demanded that everyone present sign a paper he produced from inside his coat, a statement prepared apparently in advance, declaring that nothing irregular had ever taken place on the Vale plantation regarding the status or treatment of any person named on any document, and that the events of that night concerned only a missing account book, nothing more. No one signed it. This detail is confirmed independently by both Hannah's testimony and a brief, oblique line in Reverend Marsh's letter, in which he wrote that he had never witnessed 34 people refuse a demand from a white landowner with such total, wordless unity, and never wished so much to have refused something myself so many years before. There was no uprising, no confrontation of the kind a more theatrical account might invent. There was only stillness, people standing where they had been told to stand, hands at their sides. The paper passed from one to the next and returned each time unmarked, until Augustus, according to Hannah, understood before any of us said a word that the night had already gone against him and that no amount of ink was going to fix it. Dawn came without resolution, in the sense that no one confessed to taking the ledger and no papers were signed. Augustus unlocked the chapel door himself, shortly after first light, and told those gathered that the matter of the missing book would be pursued separately and that they were dismissed to their duties. According to the plantation's own overseer's log, kept by Silas Crowe and later recovered among estate papers, the entry for that date reads only, "Meeting concluded, work resumed as usual." Nothing in the official record of the Vale plantation ever again referenced the events of that October night. But the ledger did not return, and its absence, along with what had spilled from the family Bible, set in motion a slower unraveling that the plantation's paperwork could not entirely suppress. Jonas Bell had come to his discovery of the second ledger almost by accident, and the accident itself is worth recounting because it illustrates the peculiar, patient logic by which the truth of the Vale plantation eventually made its way into the world at all. Jonas was, by the plantation's own inventory, a carpenter of considerable skill, trained originally by his father, who had held the same position on the property a generation earlier. He was sent into the main house periodically to attend to repairs the household could not entrust to less careful hands. A warped door frame, a settling foundation beam, a section of flooring in Augustus's own study that had begun, in the autumn of 1858, to creak in a way that suggested rot beneath. It was in the course of replacing that flooring, working alone in the study on an afternoon when Augustus had ridden out to inspect the tide gates, that Jonas discovered a loose panel beneath the floorboards, evidently added sometime after the room's original construction, concealing a shallow space just large enough to hold a single ledger book. He did not, by his daughter's account, understand immediately what he had found. He described to her, many years afterward, the sensation of opening the book and finding columns of names and figures that meant little to him at first glance, since his reading, though functional, was never fluent. What caught his attention was not the writing, but the names themselves, several of which he recognized as belonging to people who had once lived on the property and had, at some point in years past, simply stopped being spoken of. Not sold, as far as anyone had ever been told, not freed, not dead by any account given to the rest of the household, but absent in the particular way that absence on a plantation like the Vale property was expected to be accepted without further inquiry. Seeing those names recorded alongside figures he could not fully parse, alongside dates that did not match what he remembered being told about when those people had supposedly left, unsettled him enough that he did not return the ledger to its hiding place. He took it instead to his own cabin, wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth, and hid it behind a loose board in the smokehouse, telling no one but his wife, and telling her, by her own later account, relayed through their daughter, only that he had found something that wasn't ours to keep quiet about, and wasn't ours to give back neither. Not yet. For nearly 3 weeks, Jonas carried the weight of that decision alone, uncertain what to do with a document he only partly understood but recognized correctly as dangerous to the man who owned it. It was during this period that Augustus discovered the ledger missing and began his questioning of the household, and it was this same period, running in parallel and entirely unknown to Jonas at the time, that culminated in the night in the chapel. Jonas was among the 34 gathered that evening, and it is one of the story's stranger ironies, noted by the folklorist in her later research notes, that the very man whose discovery had precipitated the entire crisis stood in that locked room alongside everyone else, swearing his own denial with a hand upon the ribboned Bible, giving no outward sign that he alone, among those present, held the answer to the question Augustus was so desperate to force from someone. Informed afterward by his wife of what had happened in the chapel, and understanding now that the ledger he held was not merely evidence of petty theft, but the missing half of a fraud that stretched back over a decade, Jonas made contact within the following weeks with an itinerant tinware merchant who travelled the river settlements and who was known quietly among a small number of people along the Combahee to carry more than pots and needles between towns. Messages occasionally and on rare occasions. People. Precisely how the ledger left the Vale property and precisely what became of it afterward is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded in an account given decades later by Jonas's daughter is that her father told her, before his death, that he had sent Mr. Vale's numbers north before Mr. Vale's numbers could send anybody else south, and that this was the only thing he had ever done in his life that he was fully at peace with. His daughter added one further detail, offered almost as an afterthought during her own interview, which the folklorist nonetheless recorded carefully, that in the years after the war, a man claiming to represent a northern abolitionist society had once written to a Charleston newspaper describing, in general terms, evidence of falsified plantation records along the Combahee River. Evidence he declined to specify further and never followed up with any published account. No name was attached to the letter beyond initials, and no further correspondence from the same source has ever been located. Whether this letter had any connection to the ledger Jonas Bell sent north cannot be established with certainty, but the timing and the specificity of its vague claim is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Hannah Reid's account of what she did with Eleanor's letter is more directly documented because Hannah herself lived long enough to describe it. She did not surrender the letter when Augustus demanded, in the days following the chapel incident, that every person present be searched for missing papers. She had already, by her own description, put it where cloth goes, not where paper is looked for. Sewn into the hem of a garment, a detail she repeated with evident pride when interviewed many decades afterward. She kept the letter, in one hidden seam or another, for the remainder of her time on the Vale property, through the years of the war that followed, and into the uncertain peace after it. The 11 names on Eleanor's original list did not all survive the following years intact. Plantation inventories from 1859, the year after the chapel incident, show 3 individuals no longer listed among the Vale estate's holdings, with no accompanying record of sale, transfer, or emancipation. An absence that, given everything else uncovered, suggests they were moved, quietly and outside any legal channel, before the matter could draw further attention. 2 others are recorded as having died of illness that same year, though no physician's certificate survives for either death. An omission that, after the pattern already established with Eleanor's own death certificate, invites more suspicion than confirmation can resolve. The remaining 6, including Hannah Reid and Jonas Bell, remained on the Vale property through the years of war and were present when Union forces moved through the Combahee River plantations in the final years of the conflict, at which point their legal status, whatever fictions the Vale ledgers had maintained, ceased to matter in the way it once had. The fuller truth, when it finally assembled itself more than a century later in a university archives reading room, did so through contradiction rather than confession, through the small mismatches between documents that no single liar had thought to reconcile against every other record. The church register recorded a meeting of the vestry on the evening Eleanor died, called by its own minutes, to discuss matters of the roof fund, yet no personal diary or letter belonging to any vestryman named in that entry corroborated such a meeting, and one vestryman's own diary placed him at a wedding supper in Beaufort that same night, a considerable distance away. The plantation's public inventory for 1857 listed among its enslaved holdings 3 names that appeared on a later transcription of Eleanor's hidden list, marked with a small cross beside them. A mark Hannah, when shown that transcription decades afterward, identified without hesitation as Eleanor's private notation, meaning already free and should not be here at all. Nothing about any of this involved a single dramatic falsehood. It was an accumulation of small, plausible untruths, each unremarkable in isolation. each explainable by ordinary carelessness if examined alone, a vestry that might simply have failed to record an unimportant meeting, a ledger clerk who might simply have been slow to update an inventory, a notary in the Register of Deeds office who might simply have misfiled a date. It was only when the documents were laid side by side that the pattern of their disagreement became impossible to explain as anything but design. This, perhaps, is the quieter horror the researchers eventually settled on. No single man needed to be a monster for the fraud to succeed. A physician who signed a certificate for a fee and did not ask further questions. A vestry clerk who left a blank space rather than press an awkward point. A clerk in the deeds office who altered a filing date for a coin or a favor and thought no further about it. Each piece of the machinery was operated by a literate, unremarkable man performing a forgettable act, and it was the sum of these small, forgettable acts, rather than any single dramatic cruelty, that had kept 34 people bound to a plantation years after the law, however unevenly it was enforced, would have recognized at least some of their freedom. Augustus Vale did not flourish in the years that followed. The estate, weakened by wartime disruption to the rice trade and burdened, according to surviving correspondence between creditors and the Vale family solicitor, by irregularities in the estate's accounting dating to before the war, entered a slow financial decline. Augustus himself died in 1871, according to a brief notice in a Charleston newspaper of causes described only as a lengthy illness at his home on the Combahee, having by then sold off most of the estate's outlying land to satisfy debts. No obituary mentioned his first wife, his father's deed of manumission, or the events of any particular October night. He left behind a shortened will, contested for several years afterward by distant relations and creditors alike, in a dispute that a county court clerk's docket from the 1870s describes with weary understatement. As concerning matters the estate's own papers do not sufficiently clarify. Reverend Gideon Marsh left Colleton District within 2 years of the incident, relocating to a congregation in North Carolina, where he later published a slim volume of religious memoir recounting decades of rural ministry. The book, a copy of which survives in a university special collections library, describes at length his early career, his marriage, and his eventual retirement, and does not mention the Vale plantation, the chapel, or Eleanor Vale by name at any point across its 211 pages. A single sentence, easily missed, refers obliquely to a night, early in my ministry, when I failed to act as a shepherd ought, and have prayed since for the strength to have done otherwise. Whether this sentence refers to the events described here cannot be proven, but the timing and the silence surrounding it invite the conclusion. Silas Crowe remained employed, in one capacity or another, on properties along the Combahee until his own death in the early 1880s. No personal papers of his survive. The overseer's log he kept during his years at the Vale plantation, recovered along with other estate documents, contains no further reference to Eleanor Vale, the chapel, or the missing ledger beyond the single dismissive line already quoted. If Silas Crowe knew the fuller truth of what happened to Eleanor in that room in 1856, he carried it to his grave without setting it to paper, or without leaving any paper that has yet been found. The chapel itself stood for some decades after the war, used intermittently by a small congregation of freed people who remained in the area, before falling into disrepair sometime in the early 20th century, and eventually being dismantled for lumber, according to a local historical society's brief notation from a survey of the district's older structures. The coloured glass window, Eleanor's wedding gift, was reportedly salvaged before the building came down and installed in a small church some miles inland. That church, too, no longer stands. having been damaged beyond repair by a hurricane in the 1940s. No photograph of the original chapel is known to exist. The family Bible fared better than the building it once stood inside. It passed upon Augustus's death to a distant cousin who inherited the bulk of what remained of the estate, and from there through at least 3 further owners across the following decades. Its provenance recorded only in scattered probate inventories that list it, each time, simply as one family Bible worn. The cavity cut into its pages, a task that must have required considerable care and time, and about which nothing definite is known regarding who performed it or when, remained empty, a fact confirmed by at least 2 of the later owners who are known to have examined the book closely enough to notice the missing block of pages and speculate in letters that survive among their own family papers about what might once have been hidden there. Hannah Reed lived to be, by her own estimate and the rough corroboration of available census records, somewhere near 90 years of age, remaining in the vicinity of the Combahee for most of her long life after the war, working for a time as a laundress in a small river town, and later, in her final years, supported by a granddaughter who had moved to Charleston. It was in Charleston, in the early 1960s, that a folklorist affiliated with a regional historical project engaged in a broader effort to record the oral histories of the last generation born into slavery along the South Carolina Low Country, learned of Hannah Reed through a church network, and arranged to interview her. The recordings from those sessions, several hours in total, were deposited afterward in a university archive, where they remained, largely uncatalogued in any detailed way, for a number of years. It was during one of these interviews, according to the folklorist's own notes appended to the recordings, that Hannah Reed produced the letter, brittle, its folds worn soft as cloth from decades pressed inside seams of clothing she had long since replaced many times over. The letter itself moved from garment to garment across a lifetime, by her account, because paper does not last on its own. But a woman who means to keep something can outlast most paper, if she is careful. She allowed the folklorist to photograph it, on the condition, honoured in the archive's later cataloguing, that the letter itself remain in her family's possession rather than the university's. The folklorist's notes describe the moment of the photograph itself in some detail, evidently aware even then that she was documenting something unusual. She wrote that Hannah did not simply hand the letter over when asked, but instead first recited, from memory, before the pages were even unfolded, the list of names her mistress had taught her more than a century before. 34 names, spoken slowly, in the same order each time, according to the folklorist's notation that she asked Hannah to repeat the exercise twice more across separate sessions to confirm the consistency. Each time the list matched, in sequence and in substance, the names later found written on the last page of the recovered family Bible, a correspondence the folklorist herself would not live to see confirmed, since the Bible itself was not located and examined by researchers until some years after her own death, but which a subsequent scholar, working from her original field notes, was able to establish with reasonable confidence. It was this photographed letter, cross-referenced years later by a graduate researcher against surviving Vale estate records and Dr. Coffin's travel receipt, discovered independently in a separate collection of Colleton District business correspondence donated to a different archive entirely by an unrelated family with no evident connection to the Vale estate beyond the physician's own business dealings, that allowed the fuller shape of the story to be reconstructed at all. The researcher's own account of the discovery, published eventually as a modest journal article that drew little attention outside a small circle of regional historians, describes the moment of recognizing the connection between the two collections as accidental, She had been examining the coffin correspondence for an entirely unrelated project concerning rural medical practice in antebellum South Carolina, and recognized the name Vale only because she had, some months earlier, transcribed Hannah Reid's recorded interviews as part of a graduate assistantship, work she had at the time considered largely unrelated to her main research. It was, by her own description, the kind of discovery that depends entirely on two unconnected filing systems happening to be examined by chance by the same tired person in the same season. And she noted, with some evident discomfort, how easily the connection might never have been made at all, how many other such connections likely never are. Without either document, the letter or the receipt, the entry in the county docket describing an unspecified disturbance of a religious nature would have remained exactly what it appeared to be on its surface, a forgotten, unremarkable footnote, filed and left to gather dust in a records room that history, like Augustus Vale himself on that long-ago night, seemed content to let stay quiet. The overseer's log, the church register, the death certificate, the public inventory, each of these documents, examined alone, told a story of ordinary plantation life interrupted by nothing more than a missing account book and a wife's unfortunate fever. It was only the collision of the hidden and the official record, achieved by accident more than by design, that exposed the gap between what the Vale plantation's paperwork claimed and what its silences, once properly listened to, actually contained. The graduate researcher's article prompted, in the years that followed its modest publication, a handful of further inquiries by local historians and at least one attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, to locate any surviving Vale descendants willing to discuss the family's history on the record. A single distant relation, contacted by letter in the early 1970s, responded only that the family had no papers of interest from that period, a claim the researcher's own footnotes treat with visible skepticism, though no further documentation to contradict it has ever surfaced. The chapel's colored glass window, salvaged before the original building's demolition and installed in the inland church, later destroyed by hurricane, was photographed once, in the 1930s, by a Works Progress Administration survey team cataloguing historic structures in the district. That photograph, black and white and slightly out of focus, remains the only visual record of anything connected to the Vale Chapel that is known to survive, and it shows only the window itself, abstract panes of light and dark, offering no further clue to the events that occurred beneath it. The folklorist's notes record one final exchange with Hannah Reid near the end of the last interview session, which the researcher included almost verbatim, evidently struck by it. Asked whether she had ever considered handing the letter over entirely to the university or to some newspaper willing to publish the story in full so that the world might finally know what had happened on the Vale plantation, Hannah is recorded as replying that she had thought of it many times over the years and had decided each time against it. When the folklorist asked why, her answer, as transcribed, was this: that some things did not survive well kept in only one place, that Eleanor herself had understood this long before anyone else did, teaching a young woman a list of names by heart in case the paper failed, and that Hannah intended to go on doing the same, telling the story where she could, to whoever would sit and listen, while the letter itself stayed sewn away, safe, in case the telling was not believed on its own. The letter passed, upon Hannah Reid's death later that same decade, to her granddaughter, and its present location, if it survives at all, is not part of the public record. The Bible's whereabouts likewise become uncertain after the 1960s, its trail lost somewhere among the private collections and estate sales that absorb so many such objects, their significance known only to those who happen to ask the right question of the right stranger at the right time. The Combahee River still bends the same way past the low-rise where the Vale House once stood. though the house itself burned in a fire of undetermined origin sometime in the early 20th century and was never rebuilt, leaving only a scatter of brick foundation half buried beneath a stand of second-growth pine that a county forestry survey decades later would note without particular comment as consistent with an old homestead site. No structures remaining. No historical marker identifies the location. No local tour of the district's antebellum properties includes it on any published itinerary. A person could walk the ground today if they knew where to look and were willing to trespass a little on land now held by a timber company and find nothing to suggest that anything at all had happened there. No chapel, no pulpit, no ribboned Bible, no 34 people standing in lamplight, refusing, together and without a word, to sign a lie. This, in the end, is perhaps the story's truest shape. Not a single dramatic night, though the night in the chapel was dramatic enough in its way, but the much longer, much quieter aftermath, in which an entire system of paper, certificates, registers, inventories, ledgers, deeds, worked exactly as it was designed to work, smoothing over what had happened until almost nothing remained to smooth over at all. What survived did so despite that system, not because of it. A letter kept in a hem rather than a drawer. A list of names committed to memory rather than trusted to paper alone. A photograph taken almost by accident by a researcher pursuing an unrelated question, and the stubborn, uncelebrated patience of a woman who understood, long before anyone thought to ask her opinion on the matter, that some truths only survive by being kept in more places than the people who wish to bury them can think to look. What remains then is what always remained. A county docket entry describing nothing in particular, a pastor's memoir that says everything by omission, an overseer's log with one line too calm to be believed, and the memory of a woman who chose deliberately to keep the truth in more than one place, so that no single fire, flood, or convenient silence could put it out entirely. Somewhere among the last pages of that old family Bible, in a hand identified by at least one later owner as matching neither Augustus's nor Eleanor's, a list of 34 names had been added, at some point never precisely dated, not under a heading of property and not under a heading of sale, but simply listed, one after another, as though someone, long after the chapel's door was finally left unlocked for good, had wanted only to make certain that the record, however small and however late, showed that all 34 had once stood in that room and had once together refused to sign.